Good morning, everyone. I'm Tim Foxon from the SPRU, the Science Policy Research Unit at the University of Sussex. And this is a presentation with my colleague, Noam Bergman, on the role of digitalisation in low-carbon scenarios. This work is part of the Digital Society team of the UK Centre for Research on Energy Demand Solutions, CREDS. This work is part of a project on the future impacts, looking at how the adoption of information and communications technologies, ICTs, could affect energy demand as part of the transition to a net zero carbon economy. So we investigate the potential contribution of new digital technologies and related business models for reducing energy demand in the UK, whilst delivering end-use services and creating value for users. So there are two major global transitions possibly already underway. The transition to a low-carbon society, which many of us within the energy efficiency community are deeply concerned with, and the transition to a highly digitalized society, the so-called digital revolution. And we're interested in the extent and the interaction between these two transitions. And particularly work we've done so far emphasizes that the rise of information and communication technologies does not automatically lead to reduction in energy demand. It could stimulate new energy using practices or wider economic growth. So in this work, we look at future scenarios which consider these two transitions and ask what role is digitalization expected to play in a low carbon transition? And what assumptions and framings do these climate-focused transition scenarios have? We do this by investigating a number of low-carbon transition scenarios, including more qualitative projections and more quantitative models. And we identify the framings and assumptions underlying different studies, and if and how they relate the low-carbon transition to the digital revolution. In this paper, we focus on interpretive positioning of each study along 4 economic and technological axes to demonstrate a way of comparing and contrasting different scenarios. We analyze the framing of scenarios by interpreting their place along 4 different axes in relation to their relative focus on, firstly, either on decarbonizing energy supply or managing energy demand. Secondly, whether they focus on a green growth narrative or a focus on well-being and degrowth scenarios. Thirdly, whether they assume that the business models related to digital technologies are led by large ICT firms representing the status quo, or whether they assume that there will be alternative business models which empower communities and users. And fourthly, whether these scenarios assume that digital technologies lead to greater automation for optimizing energy supply and demand, or emphasize greater agency in terms of empowering users to understand and control their energy use. So for this initial work, we've chosen 7 different prominent papers and reports that offer net zero or low carbon scenarios. For UK-based projections, firstly from the Committee on Climate Change, the UK government's official advisors. Secondly, from the Royal Society, the august scientific body. Thirdly, from the National Grid, the company that runs the UK National Electricity Transmission Network. And fourthly, from the Centre for Alternative Technology, a think tank that emphasizes more radical alternatives and alternative technologies. And 3 global projections. The Smarter 2030 scenarios are by an industry-led coalition of large firms. The Heinrich Böll Foundation is another think tank based in Germany, And the Grubler et al. Scenarios are from a coalition of academics led by Arnulf Grubler from IASA in Austria. So the first axis we looked at is whether these scenarios emphasize the decarbonisation of energy supply, or the management of energy demand, or a mixture of the two. What we see is there are a range of assumptions, even within the small number of scenarios. The Grubler et al. Scenarios emphasize the reduction in demand for energy services. The Heinrich Böll Foundation scenarios also emphasize energy demand reduction. The Centre for Alternative Technologies and National Grid scenarios have a mixture, a balance of action on the supply side and demand side, whereas the other scenarios by the industry, Royal Society and the Committee on Climate Change put more emphasis on the decarbonisation of energy supply. In terms of perspectives on growth, we see that most of these scenarios assume a green growth narrative, that it's possible and desirable to decouple economic growth, rising economic growth, from reductions in carbon emissions. But here the Heinrich Böll Foundation scenarios are a standout because they emphasize focusing on improvements to well-being, understood as a wider range of social and environmental indicators. The Centre for Alternative Technology scenarios fit somewhere in the middle, with some skepticism about economic growth, but also an inclusion of the potential for decoupling growth from emissions. Thirdly, in terms of the ownership of digital technologies in these scenarios, again, a wide range from Committee on Climate Change, Royal Society, and Smart 2030 scenarios, which largely assume that large ICT firms will remain in a dominant position, a more business as usual assumption, whereas the Heinrich Böll and, to some extent, the Grubler et al. Scenario assume a greater role for public or common ownership and ideas around a digital commons where there is shared ownership and access to the digital space. In terms of the automation versus agency, again, a range of assumptions. Here, the Grubler et al. Scenario stand out as having a greater role for agency of users that digital technologies enable users to have a greater agency in how they use energy, whereas the other scenarios tend to fit more in the middle, with some more automation and some role for user agency. So what do these scenarios tell us? That they, in terms of supply and demand, all the scenarios incorporate both the need for supply side action, innovation and diffusion of low carbon technologies, and demand side action through societal and behavioral changes. But they differ significantly in the relative importance they assign to these. Supply side focused scenarios tend to be framed within a green growth narrative, assuming that it's possible to decouple economic growth from carbon emissions, whereas demand side focused scenarios tend to be more sympathetic to a degrowth narrative, focusing on enabling a wider range of well-being indicators alongside rapid carbon reductions. However, the Grubler et al. Scenario combines an emphasis on demand side solutions with a green growth narrative. The Committee on Climate Change, as you might expect from government advisors, suggested transition, focusing in the 2020 preceding a rapid electrification of transport and heating, with relatively little role explicitly for digital technologies. The Royal Society, on the other hand, highlights the disruptive nature of digitalisation, and that policy and investment can ensure that the expansion of ICTs can help to lead to more sustainable outcomes. The national grid suggests a greater need for societal engagement alongside policy to lead to a faster transition. On the other hand, the Heinrich Böll Foundation suggests that societal transformation and transformation in the way we organise our economies is key. In contrast, the Smarter 2030 industry-led report highlights the potential of ICTs to save energy and increase well-being, with consumer power driving change alongside policy. The Centre for Alternative Technology sits in between, with a recognition that climate impacts will galvanise support for collective action. The Gruber et al. Scenarios see change coming more from people seeking a better quality of life and demanding better digital products and services, which can both enhance their quality of life and reduce carbon emissions. So in conclusion, we see many different visions and assumptions with different levels of interactions between the low carbon transition and the digital revolution. There are then clearly opportunities for improving policy and stimulating public debate on what constitutes an ICT engaged low carbon transition. The transition will clearly require interconnected changes in technologies, institutions, business models, and user practices. And this will require wide public consent, which requires informed public debate on these issues. We argue that this requires the further development of more integrated low carbon and ICT scenarios, explicitly including these different drivers and causation patterns, and could play an important role in this. And we will be going on to do further work in this project under CREDS to engage with a range of stakeholders in the UK to look at how we can develop more integrated low carbon and ICT scenarios and explore their desirability and feasibility for achieving a transition to a net zero carbon economy. So thank you very much.